stop for a moment. Think about what you believe about your soul. Right now, every church tells you it's immortal. Now try to find the phrase immortal soul in the original Hebrew Bible in 39 books. I'll wait. You won't find it. Not once. I want you to hold that. Not as a curiosity, not as a trivia question, as a problem. Because you were not told at any point in your religious education that the foundational doctrine of what happens when you die, the doctrine of the immortal soul, does not appear in the scriptures it claims to derive from. The Hebrew Bible, which contains the oldest and most foundational layers of the tradition you were given, does not teach that the soul is immortal. The words are not there. The concept is not there. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly where it comes from instead. I need to tell you something up front before I show you the evidence. I am not asking you to abandon anything. I am asking you to look at where something came from. Those are different requests. And the answer to the second question, where did this come from, is one of the most consequential things I have found in 20 years of working with these texts. Because the answer is not Moses. It is not David. It is not Isaiah. The answer is a Greek philosopher who died 350 years before the birth of Christ. And I will show you exactly how his idea got into the Bible. Not in a vague sense. Precisely. Through a specific person, a specific text, a specific moment in history when the two traditions collided and one contaminated the other. And then I will show you that Spinoza, the man who was excommunicated in 1656 with the most severe decree his community had ever issued, saw all of this with complete clarity, saw it, documented it, and paid for it. The irony that closes this story is one that I find myself thinking about often, even now, because the man the church treated as a heretic turned out to be more faithful to the Hebrew Bible than the church itself. Hold that. The Hebrew word is nephesh. It appears 754 times in the Old Testament. 754. If the immortality of the soul is the central biblical doctrine that every tradition says it is, you would expect this word, the Hebrew word most often translated as soul in your English Bible, to carry that meaning. To denote something immortal, spiritual, separable from the body, capable of surviving death. It does not. Nephesh means living being. It means the breath of life. It means the creature that breathes. And the critical detail, the one that makes the traditional interpretation impossible to maintain if you read the text carefully, is that animals have nephesh too. In Genesis, the first chapter, verse 24, God creates the living creatures of the earth, and the word used for what they are is nephesh, the same word, the same noun. Applied to fish, to birds, to cattle, to every living thing that moves. If nephesh means immortal soul in the sense that the doctrine requires something uniquely human, something spiritual and eternal, something that separates from the body at death and continues in some other realm, then either every fish has an immortal soul, or the word is not doing what the tradition claims it does. The Hebrew text is not ambiguous on this point. The ambiguity was introduced in translation, but there is something more direct than the problem of fish. There is a verse so plain, so unequivocal, that I do not know how it is possible to teach the doctrine of the immortal soul while also teaching that the Hebrew Bible supports it. Ezekiel, chapter 18, verse 4. The soul that sins shall die. Not the soul that sins shall be punished. Not the soul that sins shall be separated from God. The soul that sins shall die. The Hebrew word is nephesh. The Hebrew verb is the same verb used for the death of any living thing. The soul can die. The text says so in the plainest possible language. And then there is Ecclesiastes, chapter 9, verse 5. The dead know nothing. 3 words in Hebrew. Not the dead are punished. Not the dead await judgment. The dead know nothing. There is no consciousness after death in the picture the Hebrew text paints. The picture is of a complete cessation. The ancient Hebrew doctrine, the one that preceded the contamination I'm about to describe, was not the immortality of the soul. It was the resurrection of the body. At the end of days, a future event, a collective restoration. Not the survival of an individual soul immediately upon death in some spiritual realm. What you were taught is not what the Hebrew text says. Now listen carefully, because this is where the question changes shape. If the Hebrew Bible does not teach the immortal soul, And if the doctrine nevertheless made its way into Christianity as if it were a Hebrew idea, as if it were what Moses and the prophets had always taught, then something happened. Something specific. Something that can be traced. I spent weeks in the early part of my research into this question, working with two texts simultaneously. I had them open on the desk side by side. This would have been in a reading room at a university in the east of England, north-facing windows. The kind of light that does not warm the desk even in early autumn but makes the pages very clear and flat and precise. I had Plato's Phaedo in Greek on one side and Ecclesiastes in Hebrew on the other. I was looking for the Hebrew equivalent of what Plato called psyche athanatos, immortal soul. The precise phrase, the precise concept. The idea that the soul is immaterial, eternal, separable from the body, and that death is in fact liberation. The soul freed at last from the prison of physical matter. The space in the Hebrew text where that phrase should have been if the tradition were correct was blank. I went through Ecclesiastes word by word. I went through the relevant sections of Job. I looked at the Psalms. I checked my work with a concordance. The concept is not there. The vocabulary for it does not exist in biblical Hebrew because the idea was not there to be expressed. The text had not been written by people who thought that way about the soul. They thought about the soul in a completely different way, and the vocabulary they built was suited to the thinking they were doing, not to the thinking Plato was doing in Athens 3 centuries later. I sat with the cold tea and the flat autumn light, and what I felt was not shock. It was more like the slow satisfaction of something resolving, the kind of feeling you get when a question you have been carrying for a long time finally reveals the precise shape of its answer. Not comfortable, but clarifying. The way a room looks after someone has removed a piece of furniture that was always in the wrong place. Clearer, emptier than you expected. The idea of the immortal soul is not Hebrew. It is Greek. And the story of how it crossed from one tradition to the other is precise enough to trace. Plato wrote the Phaedo around 380 years before the Common Era. It is one of the great philosophical texts in the Western tradition, a dialogue set in the hours before Socrates drinks the hemlock. In it, Socrates argues, with the careful patience of a man who is not afraid because he genuinely believes what he is saying, that the soul is the opposite of the body. The body is material, temporary, corruptible. The soul is immaterial, eternal, incorruptible. Death is not the end of the soul. It is the soul's return to its proper condition, separated at last from the matter that distorted and imprisoned it. This is the immortal soul, the one you were taught. But Plato wrote it in Greek in Athens in the 4th century before Christ. This is not a Hebrew idea. This is not a Mosaic idea. This is the product of a specific philosophical tradition, one that goes back before Plato to the Pythagoreans, to the Orphic mysteries, to the idea of metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls through multiple bodies. Plato inherited a tradition and systematized it. The idea of the soul as an immortal, immaterial entity that is the true self, temporarily housed in a body, is Greek to its foundations. 350 years before Christ, 400 years before Paul, at least 4 centuries before any of the ideas we now call Christian existed in any form. So the question is simple. How did a Greek philosophical idea, one that the Hebrew prophets did not hold, that the Hebrew text does not teach, that is in direct contradiction with what Ezekiel says about the soul, how did it end up at the center of Christian doctrine, presented as if it were the original biblical teaching? The answer has a name that most congregations have never heard, a name that should appear in every serious history of Christianity, but tends to be confined to specialist literature. Philo of Alexandria. Philo was born approximately 20 years before the Common Era and died around 50 years after it. He lived in Alexandria, in Egypt, the great cosmopolitan city of the ancient Mediterranean, where Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture had been in conversation for generations. He was Jewish by birth and practice. He was Greek by education and language. He wrote in Greek. He thought in categories shaped by Plato, and he spent his intellectual life doing something that no one before him had attempted with the same systematic rigor, fusing the Hebrew scriptures with Greek philosophical concepts, reading the one through the lens of the other. Philo read Genesis the way a Platonic philosopher reads a symbolic text. He did not read it as a historical account. He read it as allegory, as a narrative whose surface meaning concealed a deeper philosophical truth. And when he came to Genesis, chapter 2, verse 7, the moment when God breathes life into the man formed from the earth, he read it as the installation of a Platonic psyche, an immortal soul. The breath of God in Philo's reading is not the nephesh of the Hebrew text, the living being, the creature that breathes. It is something else. It is an immortal, rational principle, the Greek pneuma, the philosophical soul, inserted into matter. The Hebrew word is nephesh. Philo is reading psyche. He is translating not just the word, but the concept. He is bringing Plato into Genesis. And this matters enormously, for a reason that is not always stated plainly. Philo wrote before Paul. Philo's synthesis of Hebrew scripture and Greek philosophy existed, circulating among educated Greek-speaking Jews and Jewish sympathizers in the Eastern Mediterranean, before the letters of Paul were written. The conceptual bridge between Athens and Jerusalem had already been built when Christianity was forming. Paul did not have to construct it. He was writing in an intellectual environment that Philo had already shaped. This is not my argument. This is what the history of philosophy records. Karen Armstrong, in her study of how monotheism developed across three traditions, traces the fusion and describes it precisely. The Greek concepts became so completely absorbed into the tradition that they became invisible. What entered as borrowed vocabulary became native doctrine. The language of psyche and soma, of the immortal soul and the corruptible body, was so thoroughly integrated into the way Christian theology thought and spoke that its Greek origin ceased to be visible. It was received as biblical teaching because it had been transmitted through biblical language, even though the original Hebrew language, the language of the texts the tradition claimed to derive from, did not support it. The contamination happened before Christianity existed, in the mind of a Jewish philosopher in Alexandria, who was trying to make his tradition legible to the educated Greek-speaking world around him. And then something happened to the man who noticed. In 1656, the Jewish community of Amsterdam pronounced a cherem against one of its members. A cherem is an act of excommunication, a formal exclusion from the community, carrying with it the prohibition against any contact or commerce with the excluded person. The language of most cherem decrees is formal, procedural, relatively restrained. The cherem against Baruch Spinoza is not restrained. The decree uses language of unusual fury. It speaks of abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. It condemns him without specifying in the surviving text precisely what he had done or taught. He was 23 years old. He had not yet published anything. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the work that would make his name and horrify every institution of religious authority in Europe, would not appear for another 14 years. What had he done? There are scholars who have spent careers on this question. Stephen Nadler, in his careful examination of the episode, identifies several probable causes. One of them, and it is the one that connects directly to what we have been discussing, is Spinoza's position on the immortality of the soul, because Spinoza had already arrived, through his reading of the Hebrew texts and through his philosophical work, at something very close to what the Hebrew Bible actually teaches. Not immortality of the individual soul, not the Platonic psyche that survives death as a personal entity, carrying its memories and its identity into an afterlife. Spinoza's position, which he would later develop with precision in the Ethics, is that what survives death is not a soul in any personal sense. Certain ideas, certain aspects of the mind participate in what Spinoza calls eternity. But eternity is not time continuing. Eternity is outside of time. What is eternal about the mind is the impersonal, the abstract, the part that participates in the eternal order of things, not the personal self, not the individual who remembers and desires and was afraid on a particular evening in Amsterdam. The personal soul does not survive. What participates in eternity is not you in any sense you would recognize. This is not the immortality of the soul as any church teaches it. It is much closer to what Ecclesiastes says. The dead know nothing. What Spinoza called eternal is not the same as what the tradition called immortal. And his community, the community that had preserved the Hebrew texts, that had maintained the tradition across centuries of exile and persecution, excommunicated him for it. At 23 years old, with the most severe decree in the community's recorded history. I want to be honest with you about something personal here, because this is the part of the story that I have found most difficult to sit with cleanly, and I think you deserve to know that. I was an active Anglican for most of my adult life, practicing, not in a nominal way. I led Bible study groups on Sunday evenings. I taught in that capacity as a layman, not from the pulpit, but from a chair in a circle, which always felt more honest to me. I taught what I had been taught, including the immortal soul. I remember teaching it with confidence, this precious gift that God placed within us, the part of us that death cannot touch. I taught it as if the Bible said so, as if it was simply there in the text, evident to anyone who read carefully. It was a Sunday evening in my own study, later than I usually worked, the window dark behind the desk, the street outside quiet. I was preparing material for an upcoming session, and I was reading Ezekiel in Hebrew, which I had done many times, but always with a specific passage in mind, moving through the text with purpose rather than attention. That night, I was moving slowly. I had the lexicon open. I was looking at word roots. I came to chapter 18, verse 4. The nephesh that sins shall die. I had read that verse before, many times, in English translations that smooth it. The soul that sins, it shall die. And in that familiar English phrasing, it had never stopped me. The English obscures what the Hebrew is doing. The English word soul carries with it centuries of Platonic resonance, so that even a verse saying the soul will die does not feel like a contradiction of the immortality doctrine. You read it as, the soul will be punished, or the soul will be separated from God, and you move on. But reading the Hebrew that night slowly with the lexicon, I was not smoothing anything. The verb is muth, to die. The same verb used for the death of any animal, any person, anything that lives and then does not. The nephesh, the living being, the creature that breathes. The one that sins shall die, not be punished. Die. I sat there for a long time. The window was dark. I could hear the occasional car on the street outside, and I thought about the study group I had been leading, the confidence with which I had taught the immortal soul, the participants who had nodded and written things down, and trusted that what they were hearing came from the book. It had not come from the book. Not from this book, not from the Hebrew. It had come from Athens by way of Alexandria, by way of a philosopher named Philo, who wanted to make his tradition legible to the educated Greek-speaking world, and who had reached into Plato to find the vocabulary he needed. I did not have a dramatic collapse. I want to be clear about that. It was not a single night of crisis. It was more like realizing gradually over the following weeks that something I had been standing on was thinner than I had believed. Not hollow, thin. And that the weight I had been placing on it, the confidence with which I had taught, the assurance with which I had pointed to the book, had been weight it was not quite built to bear. I did not stop leading the study group immediately. I finished the series, and then I began preparing differently, more slowly, with more attention to the original languages and less reliance on what I had been told the original languages contained. It was not comfortable, but it was more honest, and I have found on balance that honesty carries a weight of its own, but is easier to hold in the long run. SPINOZA, who was 23 when they excommunicated him for arriving at a similar conclusion, would perhaps have said that was the expected result of reading carefully. He would not have been surprised by any of it. The question of how the Greek doctrine of the immortal soul became official Christian teaching is not a mystery. It was a debate. There were people on both sides, and the side that lost, the side that stayed closer to the Hebrew text, lost because institutional decisions were made at a particular historical moment, by people with particular institutional needs. Tertullian, writing around 200 years after the Common Era, resisted the Platonic soul. He was not hostile to philosophy, but he was suspicious of what Plato had done to the biblical picture of death. He argued for what became known as the sleep of souls, the idea that the dead are unconscious, waiting in something like sleep, for the resurrection at the end of days. His picture is much closer to Ecclesiastes. The dead know nothing. They wait. They will be raised. The resurrection is the event. The body is part of the saved person, and the Platonic idea of a soul surviving as a ghost in some intermediate realm is a contamination. Tertullian did not win. His position is not what any mainstream Christian tradition teaches today. Origen, writing in roughly the same period, went in a different direction. He embraced the pre-existence of souls, the Platonic idea that souls existed before bodies, and this eventually led him to the posthumous condemnation I have described in another context. Augustine, in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, synthesized the tradition in a direction that made the immortal soul foundational, and Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, codified the synthesis with Aristotelian precision, making the immortal soul one of the settled cornerstones of what could be taught. It was settled in part through institutional decision, through councils and condemnations and the gradual closing off of the alternatives that had been genuinely present in the early tradition. And then, in the academic year 1954-55, at Harvard University, a New Testament scholar named Oscar Cullmann gave the Ingersoll Lecture. The lecture was titled Immortality of the Soul or Resurrection of the Dead. And what Cullmann did, with the careful precision of a scholar who had spent his career in the New Testament texts, was to demonstrate that these two concepts are not the same idea. They are not compatible versions of the same hope. They are fundamentally different and in certain respects contradictory. The resurrection of the body is a Hebrew idea. It is the death and transformation of the whole person, body and soul together, the nephesh understood as the entire living being, into something new. Death is real. The body is real. The resurrection is a future collective event that undoes death as death. The immortality of the soul is a Greek idea. Death in this framework is not really death for the true self. The soul, the real person, was never fully mortal. The body dies. The soul does not. Death liberates. The afterlife begins immediately as the soul travels to its proper destination. No resurrection is strictly necessary because the essential self never died. These two frameworks produce different pictures of what a human being is, what death is, what salvation means, and what the Christian hope actually involves. They are not two ways of saying the same thing. They describe different realities. I am told, by a colleague who had spent years working specifically on this period, an encounter in a conference corridor in the north of England, the kind of conversation where people say things they do not publish, that Cullmann's lecture caused something close to academic panic in certain circles. Not among biblical scholars, for whom the distinction between the two concepts was already established. Among systematic theologians and in denominational institutions, where the implications of taking the distinction seriously were enormous. Because if Cullmann was right, the doctrine of the immortal soul was not derived from the Hebrew scriptures that Christianity claims as its foundation. It was imported from Greece. It was Plato with a Christian translation, and the tradition had taught it as revealed truth for 17 centuries. There are those who argue that the reaction to Cullmann was disproportionate, that the distinction he drew is overstated. I have read the arguments. I do not find them convincing. The distinction is in the texts. The texts are there to read. I want to close with the irony that I find stays with me longest, because it is, when you see it clearly, quite extraordinary. The Church, the institution that claims to transmit the original biblical teaching about the soul, excommunicated Spinoza at 23 in language of unusual fury for arriving at a position closer to the Hebrew biblical text than the Church's own doctrine. The Church adopted Plato, called it revelation, transmitted it for 17 centuries as if it were the teaching of Moses and the prophets. And when a man read the actual Hebrew texts and noticed that nephesh does not mean immortal soul, that Ezekiel says the soul can die, that the Hebrew picture of death and resurrection is incompatible with the Greek picture of a soul surviving death, the Church's institutional descendants, in the form of his own religious community, expelled him. With fury. With language that survives in the historical record. Spinoza was punished for reading the Bible more carefully than the institutions that claim to transmit it. Karen Armstrong, tracing the history of how the Greek contamination became invisible, describes the fusion this way. It became so complete that it ceased to be visible as a fusion. What had entered as borrowed Greek vocabulary was received by subsequent generations as the native language of the tradition. The Platonic psyche became the biblical soul. Philo's allegorical readings became the received interpretation of Genesis. And the institutions that managed the tradition had by that point no institutional incentive to trace the etymology, to follow the idea back to Athens and acknowledge that the most central doctrine about what happens when you die came from a philosopher who had never read a line of Hebrew scripture. What you are taught about your soul does not come from Moses. It does not come from David or Isaiah or Ezekiel, who, as it happens, says quite plainly that the soul that sins shall die. It comes from Plato, writing in Athens in approximately 380 years before the Common Era. It was carried into the Jewish intellectual world by Philo of Alexandria, who wanted to make his tradition legible to the Greek-speaking educated class. It entered Christian theology through the environment that Philo had shaped before Paul wrote a single letter, and it was codified as doctrine by men, Augustine, Aquinas, the councils, and the traditions that followed, who had, by that point, inherited a synthesis so complete that they could not see its seams. And SPINOZA, the excommunicated heretic, the man expelled with language of fury, the philosopher who spent the rest of his short life in relative isolation, grinding lenses to pay his rent. SPINOZA read the Hebrew texts carefully, followed the evidence where it went, and arrived at a position that the Hebrew text actually supports. The institution adopted Greek philosophy, condemned the man who noticed, and called both of those things faithful to the Bible. I do not know what happens when you die. I am not going to tell you that I do. What I can tell you is that the answer you were given, the immortal soul, the precious gift, the part of you that death cannot touch, came from Athens. It came 3.5 centuries before Christ, from a philosopher working in a tradition that had no knowledge of Moses or the prophets. It entered your Bible through a process of translation and synthesis and institutional adoption that took centuries and left no visible seam. The texts are there. The Hebrew words are there. The history of how one tradition's vocabulary replaced another's is documented in the work of historians who have been saying this for decades. Kuhlman said it at Harvard. Armstrong traced the fusion. Nadler documented what SPINOZA actually thought and what it cost him. The question of what you do with this is yours to decide. Not mine to resolve for you, but I would ask you before you go, the next time someone tells you that the immortal soul is what the Bible teaches, open the Hebrew. Find nephesh. Follow it through Ezekiel. Find the verse that says the soul that sins shall die, and ask yourself where the confidence in the other direction actually comes from. Take care of yourselves.